Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi.
My guest today is Mike Stadnisky, Managing Director of Thielsen Capital. Thielsen Capital is a seed-stage financing syndicate network bringing together life science investors, operators, and innovators to drive exceptional outcomes for founding teams, investors, and science. Before Thielsen, Mike was the CEO of Phitonex, which was acquired by Thermo Fisher. He was also VP and GM of Informatics at BD Life Sciences and was the CEO of FlowJo before its acquisition by BD. He has also taught at MIT Sloan, is an author of 10 patents, and won the 2019 International Society for the Advancement of Cytometry Innovation Award. Over the next 3 episodes, we cover a wide range of topics, including Mike's time working for Red Bull as an undergrad, his pivotal grad school experience at the University of Virginia, his transition into entrepreneurship and business development, his advice on creating and nurturing fruitful partnerships, and the lessons learned going through multiple mergers and acquisitions. Today, we'll explore Mike's early exposure to business and science, the critical skills he acquired while at Red Bull, his transformative experience in Michael Brown's lab at UVA, and his thoughts on the importance of lab culture and team dynamics in research environments. Without further ado, let's dive into this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. Mike, so good to see you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to see you, John.
So we were doing some homework on our end and really trying to find a kind of fun place to start. And we wanted to turn back the hands of time and really kind of dig in a little bit into kind of your upbringing and really just kind of learn from you and kind of get inspired on what formed your leadership style as you were growing up and your overall business philosophy.
From a very early age, my dad would tell me what was going on at work. And so he was a chemical engineer by training. He worked for Millipore, full circle because they ended up putting a flow cytometer later in water purification. And then we moved to Delaware, so DuPont, so chemicals. And then later on got into water purification and then much later on into pumps. And I was always really drawn to science because of that, because he would talk about the technical side of the business, but also he would talk about, like, very plainly with me. I remember being in middle school and he was talking about essentially a labor negotiation. And there was no holds barred on, like, hey, this is where they're coming from. This is where I'm coming from. Or, things when he was like, if he was having to deal with lawyers, he'd come home in a suit and say, man, I really need to, he'd like, hey, I want to catch up, but I really need to go take a shower first because I've been with lawyers. And, as a young kid, like, you don't realize that you're almost getting these like business lessons. And I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but it was like, hey, we're going to have these conversations really middle school and then high school. And at the time, I didn't really think much of them. Right. And I think come to find out later, I think from an early age, I was just exposed to more aspects of the different, almost like sides, right? If there's this polygon that is business. And I think that really gave me, at least gave me these exposures to these sides that I think a lot of people don't get to see. And some of those I've never had to touch, right? Whether it be because the technology was a little bit different, or the issues that he was dealing with are different because he always, generally speaking, ran really large manufacturing operations. And I think simultaneously, I got to see the push and pull and the sacrifice that my family had to make because of like the career path that he chose and the amount that he had to travel and all the rest of that. So I got to see that, with my family, the sacrifice that my mom would have to make to make that work, and what they did also get me through school and all those different aspects. I think that those were really formative pieces for me. And I think each one of those conversations, like, I always joke, like, I got my MBA from my dad, before I ever even considered what the heck I wanted to do with it. And so, from that point on, he's always been a really close advisor. So I'm blessed and really lucky that I have that exposure early on. It was a lesson for me, it's a lesson for me now. And I'll take a conference call in my car with my son. And I'm like, listen in. Like, do you know what we're talking about there? Kind of abstractly. I'm like, yeah, this is what we're doing. You don't have to go into gross detail. And sometimes you have to tell people to watch their language a little bit, but like,
yeah. You gotta just make the disclaimer.
You need like you need a post edit bleep button, but like don't say that. Don't say that's cool. Other than that, I guess it kind of opened my eyes to being like, hey, we don't. All these items. I mean, these are things they're not taught in school, but they're critical to how we form business and the kind of frame of reference we have, right? And remember that maybe just take one step back. Like a business is an organizational structure that we put around something that we want to affect, change in the outside universe, right? There's multiple ways we could do that. It could be a nonprofit, it could be a university, right? And so I think from early on, I definitely was raised thinking that and knowing that private enterprise was a way you could actually do that and that you could make a living from it and make a living also being a geek, which I think is another sort of exceptional thing to learn at an early age, right? I mean, I think it seems obvious to us now, right? Because the geek shall inherit the earth, and frankly, they have over the past 40 years. But I think when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, I don't think that was patently obvious.
It wasn't obvious to me.
It wasn't, and I think that the generation before us knew that because of the space race and because of Kennedy's emphasis on that, and because everyone was an engineer, right? Everyone was building something, and then then it kind of went away. I think we're coming back around on that. I think for the people who listen to this podcast, they're builders and they're engineers and they're scientists. They kind of get it. But I think society wide, I think that would be great if we could get back into that, frankly, that same kind of mindset of being builders and engineers. But anyway, I think it was a very different, even mindset that they had towards business, where it was like, no one was just doing business for business sake. They were engineers who were like, hey, okay, we just have to put a business around this thing. Because we need to make a living.
Yeah, we got to pay the bills.
Because this is the generation, like we've literally, this is the generation that engineered, just the generation just before engineered the most complicated human structure that's ever been built, right? Like, so, like they're like, okay, well, we'll build a business around it and then we'll make this thing, right? And that's also why, like, you see a lot of businesses that are, they're founded around the same time, right? And so I just a bit of a digression there, but that was. Looking back on that now, I think that was really formative for me. And I was just lucky to have that early on. And I was also lucky, like when I was in middle school and high school, to just see those kind of environments, like to have a job in a cubicle, which like created a lifelong hatred of cubicles.
That's so funny because I had the same experience. My first cubicle job, and it was like a suit and tie type situation. Well, so it's funny because we would all have our ties in our desks, but anytime the CEO would come through, ties on. So like CEO's in, and then we're just like quickly like tied up. And as he's doing his rounds, everyone's like buttoned up. And then the days that he's not there, just like put it back in.
That's why the clip-on was invented, right? I mean, it was
it's just like boop. Yeah, we're good. Yep,
everyone's because that's important.
Yeah, it's super important, right? Like,
that's not. That's a different kind of management by walking around, I guess. Just making sure people like are adhering to the dress code.
Yeah, unbelievable. And I mean, there's so many directions I want to take this, and I guess it sounds like your father was both in business and science. Did one appeal to you more than the other, or was it both? Where you're like, these are both sick, and
No, it was much more the science that drew me. I was just obsessed. I couldn't get enough. And I think, at least when we were growing up, thankfully it's different now. I mean, I have a 9-year-old son, and like he works in a lab, like, and can like do cool stuff and is dissected an animal already. I'm like, dude, I would have killed for that when I was his age. So it was much more standard, like, likely you're going to learn Linnaean and biology. You're going to learn taxonomy. You're going to, all of it's going to be on this. All of it's going to be from this textbook. Like that was very much like, and that was really all. Is always how it was. And like, you're lucky to get your hands on a microscope before you were in 8th grade. I think, for me, the kind of the proof in the pudding, at least at a young age, was like I grabbed an old chemistry textbook of his and just started studying it on my own. Because it just felt like secret knowledge when I was a kid. I think you read all these. I read a ton of science fiction, and when you actually start reading, a textbook around chemistry, you're like, oh man, like it's kind of like being let in the secret door. You're like, whoa, like there's knowledge here, and like you could do some cool stuff with this.
Yeah, it's like alchemy.
It's totally like alchemy.
Yeah,
You
It
know,
felt like that for me.
particularly like, as a kid, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You're like, whoa, like we can make stuff like that. This is before this is before the biotech revolution too, right? Like you had told me that at that time you could like effectively, I guess in kid language, teach a bacteria how to sing a new song. It would have blown the brain out of my back of my head. I mean, I think so just even having that access was just awesome. And then, and I had the privilege of going to a high school where and this was like, this to me was like, this was it for me. This was bee's knees. Freshman and sophomore year, there was a combined biology and chemistry program. So you did 1 semester biology, 3 semesters of chemistry, and then 2 semesters of biology. If I ever came up with that idea at Stanford School, unbelievable, because they're not siloed, right? And you right out the gate, it's like, if you could kind of write a script for like, hey, how do you get kids interested in life science? That's it. You just show them like that there's two sides of this and that they're dependent on each other, right? And that to me was like, I remember having those classes and then watching Gattaca, and that was it for me. I was like, I'm hooked. Maybe you had the same experience, and that was it.
That's so funny that you brought up Gattaca. That's the same experience as me. And I also I agree with you. I think at least it always felt siloed and like almost like two like kind of like fiefdoms, but like chemistry and biology, that is. But like it took me until like university. Like I did have a high school program that was like that, but it didn't take me until university to like really like stitch it all together. And I'm going to guess that experience probably informed your decision to do biochemistry at Clemson. And you're talking about your son having like lab experience as a 9-year-old. Did you have a lab experience as an undergrad?
Oh yeah. I mean, but look, like I didn't get to touch biochemistry again until I was a junior. It's like you're kind of back on the recipe of like you got to 2 cups of sugar and so you got to do all the basic classes. Even if you come up with a bunch of credit, doesn't matter. Like you got to fill these, you got to check all these boxes first, which is fine. Until you and at that point, it's almost like you're earning the advanced biochemistry course. And I think of the other, I think it certainly led into, I mean, I still thought I was going to be an engineer when I started, and then like briefly thought I was going to be a political scientist, or like, I don't even know what political scientist would be. I don't know. I mean, it's no offense to people who have a poli-sci degree, but like, it's just having been in multiple poli-sci classes doesn't seem very scientific to me. But anyway, I digress. It's like the other like appealing thing about biochemistry, I'm not going to around your lab question, is it was hard. Like the first biochem class, it was pretty much like, and it was like, you better buckle up, folks. And at Clemson, because it's got an agricultural background. I mean, it's kind of wild, like the number of folks. You could divide the whole universe, right? You have the 2 kids in the front that are going to dental school, so they had to work harder than anybody because statistically speaking, that was really hard. And then you have all the pre-meds, right? The collar-wearing pre-meds, and then sort of pre-gunners, and then you had like the ag folks who were like some bad, some not, right? So like this is before Carhartt was cool, so you knew exactly who they were. And then you had like the biochemistry kids who were like, they're finally, after years of being interested like you are. This is like, you're at Mecca. You're like, oh my God, we're here. Like acting all day. Let's do it. Like, and just on the edge of the seat, everyone's telling us to shut up because we're asking questions, right? Like, hey, tell us about rigor mortis and how actin and myosin are locked. And they're like, yeah, like more. And everyone's like, yo, can we go? So I think that's what is appealing about biochemistry. And I think there's a cohort really of 2 years of classes that both kind of really vibed on that. And I think that was really lucky with that. And then, yeah, I had some research experience in undergrad. I mean, it was good exposure, but I mean, it's amazing that the postdoc just tolerated my existence in that lab. I mean, I was not useful. I should have been washing glassware.
Yeah. That was the same experience with me. And like in retrospect, I was like, and I joke about this, but I'm like half joking only. It's like, I was a liability in that lab. I was going to I probably destroyed the cell lines, like for sure, like not like doing it properly, just like, and the postdoc just like,
yeah, they need like a fake cell culture lab for people like you and I, right? I mean, it's a wonder that we were ever able to like move forward. But I I mean, luckily that's something else where like the narrative has changed, where they like get you in early enough so that you know what not to break. You know what I mean? Like, at least they're getting them in as like sophomores and freshmen. Because like, yeah, you do all these like lab experiments, which are totally cookbook, right? Like run a gel, but there's nothing compared. I mean, there's not even like a good analogy. I mean, it's like learning how to like pass a ball and then all of a sudden playing rugby. I mean, it is that much of a difference in terms of how full contact the research environment was. Yeah. And yeah, it's like a wonder. I mean, people like you and I are like, oh yeah, we still want to do this. Like after, like the mentors must have been like, all right, man, well, good luck. I mean,
you're entering a world of pain, and you don't know where the pain is derived from. Like more often than not, you're just like running an assay and just like doing it what you think is like the exact same way and just getting very different results. You're just like, well, the book told me it was supposed to come out this way, but it clearly didn't, and I don't know how to troubleshoot this.
Oh yeah, or yeah, like, gosh, just the number of like cutting out the wrong band from a gel pre-mass spec, or I just like the number of protocols that like messed. It was just like, I mean, no wonder consumable budgets for undergrad labs are expensive. Like, it's just, you're just ripping through stuff. I mean, I think I had like one personal win, which is like, I still remember, which is like I was able to program the HPLC robot to like drop water where it needed to go, which which is like honestly simpler than like what I see kids doing with like Lego robotics now. Like way simpler, but at that time I was like, yeah, I'm like, yeah, I did it. Yeah, hey, look at me.
That's so funny. So it sounds like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the undergraduate experience was more a little bit like kind of the beginning, just like cram it, and not until the later like junior, senior years where you actually got more hands-on. But even at that, it was still kind of surface level of that at that.
Very much so. I mean, I think it was, I would call it like a very traditional didactic education in that regard. I mean, great biochemistry program, and like you come out knowing all the fundamentals. And the nice part about the scholarship program I was in, you could choose any class and take it. So, you know, I got to take Middle Eastern politics. I also got to take like an advanced microbiology course. I could take a botany course. So like, I think it was almost, that part was actually more like a traditional university education where you're actually getting a little bit more liberal arts education, which I really appreciate. So it's hard almost kind of now to like look back and kind of stack up, like, would it have been worth it to spend more time in the lab doing undergraduate research? Depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, I know guys that got Fulbrights. I mean, that's awesome. That's what they want to do. And they knew really early on, that's not what I wanted to do. And I look back now and I still feel, I don't think there was a level of intentionality there. I just think it was more just like, hey, what's fun? This will be the only time in my life where I'm able to learn all this stuff, essentially professionally. So let's go try this. And there's also a ton of outside the classroom education that was going on. I mean, I think the one notable one that people keep coming back to, and it's actually like, depending on who the person is, if they don't understand the science I do, they're like, they'll pitch it like, they'll be like, oh, this is Mike. And they'll be like, he's got a PhD, but he used to work for Red Bull. And like, that's how they, like, okay, that's your spin. Okay, that's fine. But that in itself was like, that being said, like to me, that was like a transformative experience that I did not expect to get. And funny enough, I remember when I wait on incubation times, I'll be writing up my Red Bull reports. And like try to combine those two, kind of smash them together, ended up being something that was really important, particularly post PhD. So there was always something that was outside the classroom that was always going to grab my attention. And again, I don't think that was intentional. It was one of these things more like looking back, it was like, well, those are good opportunities that I took. So yeah.
What was that Red Bull experience like? If we can kind of dive in a little bit, I'm fascinated. My one friend, like growing up, was like really good at skating, and he was sponsored at one point in time. And so my one kind of interface with Red Bull was just him coming over with like crates of Red Bull to fill our fridge. But that's the extent. But it sounds like you had a more kind of like commercial kind of like, responsibility. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I remember the job being pitched to me by this guy I was on student government with, and I don't know why he chose me out to be it's called student brand manager. And you get one per campus. And this is before at that time, there were some rules around like you could not market this with alcohol. It was that was like separation of church and state. So that was kind of interesting. And I mean, the job was pitched to me as like, hey, dude, this guy from Cincinnati, dude, all you do is you get free Red Bulls. And I was like, that sounds kind of like,
It doesn't sound like a job.
it doesn't sound like a job.
Yeah.
But then when I interviewed with my boss, Veronica, I mean, she was like, she asked really great. I mean, she was asking really good questions, and essentially trying to like incite my skepticism of Red Bull. She's like, "What do you not like about Red Bull?" I was like, "What's a different kind? It's a different kind of company." And I kind of like lambasted their ads, which I still don't like. But the problem is like we all remember them, so that's kind of the point. And so I took the job. And I was like, okay, well, this is some extra money. This will be fun. And I think what I didn't realize was I was joining them at kind of a seminal moment where they had just started creating a market where, I mean, you're selling $2 cans of sugar water with a irrelevant amino acid in it and caffeine. So you want to talk about alchemy? This is real alchemy, because there was just starting to be some competitors in the market, and we had to figure out a way. It's kind of interesting you share your experience. I think the gap I identified was a couple of gaps. The first gap was Red Bull is just seen as like this extreme sport thing, right? Skaters, snowboard. And it's so distant. Like you're in South Carolina and you see like a snowboarding video where someone's like doing a flip. Like, who cares? This doesn't relate. Like, can't relate to this. And so I think that was the first gap. They're like, well, how do we leverage these assets? And my first kind of feeling was like, you don't?
Yeah. Not snowboarding.
Because I just can't care. Like it's like a lot of these different extreme sports. And so I think where we started there, and where I think I had most of my success was kind of created this second thing, which was sort of like, okay, where do you meet people where they're in a moment of need, of energy, right? For multiple different reasons. We can talk about some examples. And then how do you handle that interaction? Because remember, they're not paying for it, but your job, the thing you're selling, is that they will remember and associate Red Bull with that need and in that moment that you're making. So you have to make that memory. That's really important, because otherwise, if you just give somebody like a Red Bull in a library, like which we did sampling, sure, and you do that during finals week, that's like, okay, got it. That's block and tap. That's the simple stuff. Okay, maybe people remember it, maybe they don't, whatever, right? And we had whole teams. We had a mobile energy team. That if you ever seen the people in like the Red Bull truck, that's what they did. When you come to like block and tackling stuff where and you're just doing sampling, good. Decent kind of retention there, but there's very little brand loyalty, right? And kind of hard to measure like, okay, how much exposure are people getting? So I think there was like 3 different types of interactions I think kind of like show how you can kind of insert that memory, if you will. The first one was the Society for Automotive Engineers, which ended up being a right place, right time kind of thing. These were guys that would choose to build a essentially miniaturized Formula One car. And from Thursday night until Monday morning, when they had to go back to school, these guys would not sleep. And instead of partying like, every other college student, they would be in a workshop on the edge of campus with the music blasting, welding, looking, like in CAD. I was like, I remember showing, I still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I would show, and the other thing was like, when do you choose your time, right? When do you go? And the answer is you don't go at 8 p.m. on a Friday. You go and it makes a difference to them, right? So I show up at, 11 p.m. or midnight, right, on a Friday. And they're like, who the hell is this guy, right? And I'm like, who the hell are these people? This is what these folks are doing at midnight. It's amazing. And there's no beer inside, there's no cake. Like what's happening here? And so then created this philosophy around like care before you share. I'm not there for and the first thing is I'm not there for Red Bull. I'm like, what are you guys doing? And then like, tell me about the car. What have you been building? And then you get to nerd out. I mean, it turns out I end up becoming a Formula One fan because of these guys, right? I was just like, this is incredible. So this is this notion of like care. And then boom, insert your we got these great backpacks, like laptop bags that had little mini coolers in them. And then boom, hit them with Red Bull. Dude, I gotta tell you, that in that sequence, in that moment, if you can find something that's analogous to that, that's it.
That's incredible. Because I think on paper, people just think of like exactly what you're describing before, just like final season. It's like, but if you just like dig a little bit deeper and trying to find some, like, again, caring before sharing, I've never heard that used in that way, and I love that, because like people can also smell it from a mile away if you don't give a shit about. And so I'm going to imagine your enthusiasm when you got there was infectious, and that kind of like, it's like people are very receptive to these kinds of things, and even outside of like just Red Bull, just like anytime you're trying to, whether it's sales, BD, marketing, like people have a great BS meter. And it's something that you can't just like bludgeon someone with it and not give a crap. You have to like actually, relationships matter.
Absolutely. I would add maybe a little point on that, which is that, and I think it is one of the unique things about our industry is that, and I think it's what draws people into the industry, and then it draws people like you and I who like serve the biotech and pharma industry, which is that we get to interact with passionate people. And I think the mistake that people make is that they're like, well, you're passionate. That's great. Cool that you're working on that. You need this, right? And then it's just like, this is obviously something you need. And it's like, well, how are they passionate about what specifically are they doing? And I think to me, that kind of informed early on, like, maybe I don't have the solution for these people's problems, but no matter what, if I walk away and I'm stoked up on what they just told me about, or like that's something that's super cool, that's a win. Like I've acquired new knowledge. Again, we've created this relationship kind of from scratch. And it's not like, oh, I'm the greatest listener in the world. I'm not. But like, I'm just not, right? I mean, people would always be like, 2 ears and one mouth. That's like a famous thing people say all the time in the South. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But it made me uncomfortable. But at the same time, it's like, I don't think it's actually listening. I think it's there's this interaction of like, hey, how can we infect each other a little bit about how excited you are about something? And if there's a fit here, then we can create like this flywheel of like, hey, you know what? This thing you're talking about over here that sucks, that's stopping you from this passion being this, this fire that we really want to stoke. Okay, now we've got something that can keep this going, right? And I think bringing it back into the Red Bull thing, that's what we did there. And I mean, I remember we ended up placing a fridge in a garage, and we ended up placing someone on the Baja team. It was like one of the first reality shows, and they followed this kid through the Baja season. And we ended up placing somebody on the FIA, which is the governing body for Formula One. And then I think my favorite story is I'm doing this let's be clear, in the middle of a bunch of cornfields in South Carolina. And then Red Bull buys a Formula One team.
Oh, the timing.
I mean, quite literally, right? And they're like, well, how do we do automotive marketing?
Well,
now relate this back to what we just talked about. Okay, now you have an asset, and you have a very clear, like, okay, we've got the whole story here, right? Like, and so that was a right place, right time kind of interaction. I think it taught me a lot about things that I would take with me. We did the same thing for a couple of other engineering groups, right? That were just doing that, and then also I would also say like, groups that were nerding about stuff that was also cultural was something else that was a totally different axis, but what was fantastic, right? I mean, I ended up celebrating very memorable. I ended up having a great interaction with like Indian Students Association, and they invited me to Holi, which is like the Festival of Colors. If you want to talk about people who need energy,
yeah,
it's like an endurance, like body painting festival. And I remember I brought the Red Bull cooler up, and they were starting to use that to mix with the paint and drink. I was like, this is it. I mean, and this is before Instagram, this is before like all that stuff. I just remember so distinctly, like, man, this is crazy. But it's another example where it's like, here are people who are very passionate about the different events they're putting on and the different festivals, and like, and it was they were just an amazing group. But again, another one where they're meeting up to like plans. I can't remember what it was. They were meeting up to like plan something and have a meal. And it was late on like a Thursday night, right? Which for most undergraduates, particularly in the South, is definitely the start of the weekend, if not Wednesday. And again, show up and they're like, what the heck are you doing here? And I'm like, I heard you guys were planning something, like what? What you guys are interested in? Same kind of thing, right? And that ended up being an incredible relationship, and met some really cool people. And I remember I used to play rugby. I remember showing up when I stopped playing. I remember actually showing up to a rugby game, and I was like coated head to toe in mud and like different colors. People were like, man, what is he getting into? You know, oh, I'm just doing my job.
Yep. Just out in the field.
Here we are. So anyway, like I think it was just a blast and learned a ton. I had a great, incredible boss who was a little bit sad that I didn't like end up continuing on with that. But yeah, Red Bull was awesome, man. It was super fun.
That's super rad. And like, how did you go from being in the field, getting active, and then being like, time to get back in the lab for a PhD? Like, you know, very different things, right? This is like, you know, you're like going out, you're going like meeting new groups of people. I've always thought about my lab experience, and it's like, it can be very isolating. And like, you know, I realized, even though this podcast might make me seem like extroverted, I like know myself. I'm actually pretty introverted. I'm good at like conversations with small groups. But even for me going into the lab, like, damn, it's lonely. Like, it is lonely. So you're out in the field, you're meeting people. You're like, okay, I'm about to go into solitary confinement for a bit. What compelled you to do that? Kind of, when did you know it was time to go back into the lab for your PhD?
I mean, I think there was a very intense indication this wasn't for me. I think kind of to the other end of what you're discussing. But, you know, when we would go and do like a long weekend for like Red Bull work, you just didn't sleep. You just burned the candle with a welding torch at both ends. And to the point, it was all extrovert all the time. And you had to be on. Like, I remember there being a discussion about like, how do I yawn?
Oh, man.
Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, there was just a little bit of like, man, this is, you know, like, okay. I mean, like a notable time is like, okay, we go to a hotel in Tribeca and we're eating all day. And then like you go out to the, you know, dinner, and then you go out to party. And then like all of a sudden they're like, oh, hey, Puff Daddy's at this location. You need to go pitch him. Because you got to remember that Red Bull also did not pay for celebrity placements. So all that stuff happened because people, kind of in a similar scenario as we were just discussing, would insert the product and get it somehow into that, right? So then you're pitching, you know, you're getting a BS in biochemistry, but all of a sudden you're pitching Puff Daddy on, that actually happened, right? So and the leverage there that we had was like both product, but also, funny enough, riders. So the rider is a list that people send ahead to the concert hall, right? And so guess what? All of these concert halls are all Coke or Pepsi venues. Red Bull's an independent company, but guess what? The band members and the crew members and everybody wants, because of their, you know, evening escapades. When they get into that concert hall, they want Red Bull. So there's the leverage, right? And that's how you end up with all these placements, et cetera. So we did that but it was enough of that to just be like, I'll die at 26.
Yeah. It sounds like it. I was getting tired.
It's the opposite of what you described in the lab.
I got tired literally just like putting myself like in your shoes for a moment, like a full day. You party, and then you're like, oh, there's more work on your plate, and you got to be on point.
Yeah, 3.
Yeah, and you're like, all I want to do is sleep right now. Like,
yeah, because like we're back up at 7 meeting, and then like you're worried about yawning, and you know, like you're like, man, okay, like this is like the quickest path to like a fast death. You know what I mean? I also just think, look, I had never deviated from the course of still being a nerd, you know, and I just love science. And I mean, I remember giving a mini lecture at one of our meetings about, they probably didn't love it, but like how we could have chosen any random amino acid, to be in it. Like taurine, I remember we created a whole nother energy drink that just had some other random amino acid, and people were like, oh, that's a pretty good idea. And you're like, that's not why this works, right? Like people have an association with this. They have a relationship with the product, right? I still do. And I don't shoot, like, for instance, when I go into a store, if you're like, well, like I need to pick me up, even to this day, it can't be afternoon because I'm old now, but like, I'm going to go choose a Red Bull, which is crazy to say, but like, there's a reason for that. Right. Anyway, so the point is like, I had never deviated from being a scientist and being a nerd that whole time. And this was just something that was fun. It was very, very different. And I don't want to say it was like a distraction. At the time, I didn't realize all the stuff I was learning. Right. I mean, they had this amazing triangle that we ended up using and using in the FlowJo business, which was It was like try, know, believe, love. And it kind of, this was like before customer experience was like a real good buzzword. Like they just had it figured out. Like and they're teaching undergrad, so they have to simplify it way down, because most of the other folks who are doing this marketing with me are frankly what you kind of consider like old school jocks and stuff at that time. I'm sure it's changed. But, and you couldn't use alcohol marketing. So I was kind of like, okay, well, that's hell. And so, it was a bit of a sideshow. It ended up paying dividends, but not another one of those things where I'm glad I did it. But I think in the time there wasn't like a intentional, like, oh, hey, this is going to work. I think the counterbalance to like the lab thing is, I think this is now looking at it, with hindsight, is all of those things ended up helping me realize like how far away science and life science tools was from like anything that was consumerized.
I would even say now it still feels that way. And it's been a lot, like we've been doing this for a long time. And it's just like, still like, it's still like this.
It's still like this, and it's so frustrating. And I mean, I think the easy stuff to do, if you hire the right team and you talk about it in the right way, is to use this stuff in your commercial efforts to be successful, right? Assuming that you've done the right, correct things on your product. So like this huge basis of assumptions here. But I think the hard things to do are like, hey, how do we meet our customers where they are with like the experience that they should demand from their tools and from these businesses, right? And so I think what we end up doing at biotech is over serving with people, because we simply cannot spend the capital to meet their expectations on pure software. I think it's one thing where I keep coming back to. I'm like, I'm sorry, like your consumer software is just going to beat the pants off us because they're going to overspend on us. So what we're going to do is we're going to meet you on customer success, and we're going to meet you there, and you're going to have great relationships, and we're going to work together, and this is going to be more like a team effort because we just simply can't address you there. And then we're going to bring the innovation on the other side, whether it be hardware or consumables or what have you. But we just can't, and that's where all the money's going to get spent. But like your interaction with that is always still going to be a little bit, it's not going to be at the level of like, it's not going to be the level of your iPhone. We just can't go there. And I think that's always going to be a gap. They're just going to always outpace us there. So it kind of puts the pressure back on us to be like, man, we really got to hire the right people, the right scientists, particularly to like partner with our customers. And then on the other side, we better be innovating where there's true pain points here that we're addressing, where we can innovate, so that we're meeting them on both sides. Because we're in the middle, we're never gonna get to them the same way, right?
So it sounds like you're like, okay, Red Bull, it's a wrap. You're now at UVA. Can you talk a little bit about your grad school experience and being in Michael Brown's lab?
I think what I always tell people is like, a lot of people don't enjoy getting their PhD. Like they treat it like a grind. I frankly had a blast. I know I honestly had to teach myself I had to learn how to study, which was like a first. I mean, I think undergrad was rigorous, but I could just cram and make it. You know what I mean? And I was just lucky, and like I was just good at school, right? I mean, folks that go to grad school are good at school. Like they like being in school, and there was some positive feedback. Some teachers kept being like, "You're great at this," and you're like, "Sweet, I'm going to do this for 20 years. I'm going to do this for 30 years." Like, and then you're in grad school, and you're like, "Oh, I'm not as good at this as I thought." Phew. Oh, and like, so you end up with two gaps. The first gap is like this academic gap, and then the second one is what you described, which is like the lab gap, right? So okay, how do you close these, right? In the academic gap, it was like, all right. It's like kind of the first time I was like, you know what? I'm just going to, I hate to say it. Like I treat it like a competition. I mean, I think people I went to grad school with will probably laugh and be like, yeah, you did. And I was just like, I'm going to hustle. I'm going to out hustle. Like this is business now. Like we really are. And it ended up being like, it turns out like we were all kind of like in it together. Right. And like I had a great grad school cohort and have kept up with some of them. And like, I was really lucky about that. But at the time I was like, this is happening. Like I'm going to out hustle, out study, and I'm just going to like this academically, like this, the game is on, right? Because you're only in classes for like a year and a half. But you get to learn from experts. I think the cell biology class at UVA was taught, essentially one teacher would come in and teach their expertise for a week. It was awesome. And you got to read, journal articles. It was pure nerd all the time. I mean, it was like binge nerd mode, right? And like, you just got to have that, that experience of just learning all of this. And then eventually you kind of come around to like what you really want to, sink your teeth into, right? And I got to tell you, it was definitely not yeast genetics, because you go through a semester of that, you're like, whew. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're like, oh man, that's holy smokes. Like if I never have to draw another budding yeast or like go through that again, I'll be totally happy. And like people that have done yeast genetics, and I'm talking about, I mean, look, I'm glad you guys are doing that stuff, but holy smokes. Like just that, and like all the histone modifications that you can ever imagine. Like still, like it's just it's in the recesses of our brain. We have histone modification PTSD. Like it's just like, whoa. So you know what you don't want to do, right?
Yeah. Which is important.
Yeah.
It's important.
Totally. It's actually it's the one piece of like probably I'm in this position now. I give a lot of people career advice. Just figure out what you don't want to do first. Like that's easy. I think that's really what the academic part of grad school was like. And then like most graduate school programs, we do a bunch of rotations. And a lot of that's just about like sort of chemistry and the people you get along with. And particularly it's funny because I mean, you certainly want to get along with your PI, but like it's honestly more about the graduate students that are in your lab, right? And at UVA, it's not a very postdoc heavy academic environment, which I didn't realize at the time because I didn't know any different. But again, looking back on it now, it's really useful because if you're a PhD student, you don't just kind of want to be the intern of the postdoc, right? And this isn't to like put down big labs or put down programs that are all postdoc based. But if as you mature as a graduate student, you're able to really carve out your own research program and kind of, just to be frank, rule the roost a little bit and bring undergrads underneath you, like you're getting an exceptional graduate education, right? And I don't think, graduate schools aren't judged on that. They're judged on like publications, grants, etc. But like that is not a good measure of the quality of the education, right? The good measure of the quality of the education is like, are you doing something that you're going to do in your career? And the answer at UVA was yes, absolutely. They didn't position it that way. And I don't know if there was actually a lot of thinking around that, but it turns out like when I talk to folks who are like in biotech now, like the undergraduate student who ended up being way better, the graduate student who ended up being way better in the lab than I was, like way better. Let's just be honest. Jeff Teo, you know who you are. Like, like we're now looking back now, we're like, yeah, that was awesome. Like at the time, you're just in lab. So did a rotation in Mike Brown's lab, and Mike Brown's just he's just an incredible human being. He's just somebody I looked up to. And joined his lab was very, very small. I mean, I've actually, at that time, essentially his lab was about the size of like a large office. And we looked out on like a industrial courtyard, and like once we put there was an old applied biosystems machine in there, and that took about a third of the lab. So it was like we were all working in a cubicle again. It was close quarters, like working in a submarine. So it was kind of like a nice esprit de corps, like for when we had that, and but like a really cool team of graduate students that were there. Again, it was a graduate student who was ruling the roost, Madi, who was like, she was just awesome, great personality, tons of energy. She ended up, by the way, joining BioNTech right before
There we go.
Yeah. So, you know what I mean? Like it's like just wild, right? And so there was just an amazing, and she just did an incredible job of like creating a lab culture that the right people really wanted to be a part of. And like, I would definitely give her credit for that. It was incredible. And kind of keep people honest, trying to keep people humble, particularly me, which I'm sure was a challenge. And, but it was great. So I think that's really why I chose it. And then the science obviously I would say it was the 49% of the other reason to join too, right? You got to choose the right environment to be successful. Certainly saw that. And then the 49% was like, we get to study essentially the host immune interface for viruses, and we get to study innate immunity, and that was really appealing to me, right? I'm not going to say I was like anti-adaptive immunity, which is kind of like a strange like thing to say, like that you can have an opinion like that, like that was CD4s, but like immunologists know this, right? And first of all, there's a couple of different things. Let's just clear the air. All immunologists are jealous of neuroscientists. Okay, that's why we call them dendrites. Okay, that's why we call it the immune synapse. Let's just get that out of the way. Okay, that's point one. Point two, every immunologist has a favorite cell, and that will dictate kind of their personality and then how they like work in the universe. Okay, we all have someone who we know who's a B cell biologist. Okay, They go to bed early. You know what I mean? Like they're B cell biologists. We all know, right? And then there's like CD4 biologists. Like they're actually very helpful. I've never met a CD4 biologist who's actually not themselves helpful. Okay. Now you got CD8 T biologists, right? Like they're like, you know, kind of they're having their heyday right now. Like they're feeling their swagger, right? They're not killers. I studied NK cells. So like, you know, you got to be a killer, right? That's just the way it is. And you got dendritic cells. They're a little, you know, people study dendritic cells a little more extrovert, right? So like people fall into these, this is pure theory, but like they fall into stuff. And we were studying NK cells. It was fun. It was like, man, they're like pretty aggressive cells, and like they're going in and kicking stuff up based on essentially MHC presentation. Like let's, you know, like they're knocking down doors and kind of figuring out like where they're at later. And that frankly was probably fit my personality. And it certainly fits some of the personality of other people who were in the lab. And so anyway, it was a lot. That was fun. It was just the scientific stuff was fun. And it was also the first time I got to touch a flow cytometer.
By the way, everything you just described, just like I just had that Ratatouille moment because I was at Berkeley. I was in Tolman Hall, which by the way doesn't exist anymore because they knocked it down because it's not seismic retrofitted. So I was in a building where it was like, yeah. And our lab was also quite small. And it was funny too, because we were like quasi basement. So there was like a window, but it was only like this big.
Yeah, you got a little bit of daylight.
Yeah, just a little bit of daylight. I was like, oh my God. Like, and that was the first, and our lab was a biorad lab. Oh, and so and so it had that same interaction. I was like, what's that? And then that's the ZE5, don't touch it. Very expensive. Like that was the thing. And I was like, oh,
absolutely.
All right.
This is your first year in the lab. Like, do not.
Yeah. Don't touch that, please.
Don't touch. That's not for you.
Yeah. Like, you can touch the nano drop. Like, that's okay. You can touch the nano drop, but don't touch that, please. And
yeah, you're not going to run PCRs.
yeah, exactly. It was massive on the bench. Like the E5 was like far larger. I was like, all right, I guess I'm going over here.
Oh yeah, like you work in your little, 2-foot space or whatever.
Yeah,
with it. That's exactly line. Like John Cheese spots here, or like, and then you label your bets and pushed into the back.
Yeah, that was exactly it. Yeah. I remember that vividly. So it sounds like it was like, in this lab where you kind of first flow cytometer. And I'm going to guess this is kind of where it kind of like kicked things off for you. And I'm going to guess it sounds like the academic track, you're like, no, not doing that.
No, I considered it for a long time, John. I think I didn't. It sounds crazy because I think what ends up happening, this is like another side. I think what ends up happening is people look at like a resume or they look at like a LinkedIn or whatever, and they're like, wow, like they must have planned this whole thing out. No, they didn't. Like, this is how we are being humans, right? We create this like backwards narrative. I didn't do any career planning. I didn't even really devote any thought to it, which I think might have been an advantage until way too late. I mean, John, until I was like at UVA, you walk down the lawn to graduate. I was like, oh man, what am I going to do with this? Like that's when the moment hit me. And I was like, oh shit, like what? And way too late. Advantage or disadvantage? No, I think that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed it. I wasn't stressing about it at that time. And it was just all about the science and the execution of science. And, I had the opportunity to first work on the first flow cytometer I had was a fast scan, which was upgraded by Cytec, because Cytec used to do upgrades and service, and it ran inside. It was like the Millennium Falcon. I mean, this thing was absolutely bomb proof. But you had to like talk to it correctly.
Yeah. Just like, yeah.
Like you had to like sometimes the fluidics pumps are kind of like you need to elbow, and I very distinctly remember the first time running a flow cytometry experiment, like all day on a Saturday. It was Yufang who kind of just taught me like, hey, this is how you run a flow cytometry experiment. And gravitated towards that technology. I ended up bringing a lot more flow tech into our lab, and we ended up kind of upgrading that and moving into, we just didn't have a flow capacity in the lab. I would say at that time, that's something that I got to really lead, and just, I loved the tool side of it. Which I think is something I'll kind of revisit in a second, because my PI kind of early on when we were looking at RT-PCR machines, I started stacking them up and I wrote like a 5-page report on like, why are we not going to go with this applied biosystems thing that's a lamp based because it's got edge effects, et cetera, or edge wall effects. He was like, where the hell did this come from? And
you can handle this. I'm not going to.
Yeah. So it was like, oh, like looking back, of course, I'm like, oh, that was a pretty early indication that like I was all about like the tools. Like it was all tools all day for me. And funny enough, this will come back around, but the other there's a couple of distinct memories I have from graduate school. One, because like, and then there's maybe like a lesson. A couple of distinct memories. One, the first time I ever used FlowJo, I was crying because the person who's running the core lab dressed me down for not labeling my parameters. It's just like FL1. And it's the only time I ever cried in grad school, right? There's no crying in baseball until there's crying in baseball. And so, man, she dressed me down in front of the whole court. Everyone's running their samples and she just, oh my God, it's savage. And I was like, I think I was a second year. I was like a beginning second year student. My family was visiting that weekend. And I remember I was just like wrecked. Like, my family's like, you okay? I'm like, man, I just got my butt handed to me. Like the whole hallway was like, what the hell going on in there? I was like, man, it's like, you talk about something you'll never, even if I ran a flow cytometer to this day, I promise you those parameters, they'd be labeled, right? It was like more than a decade ago. And the second thing was I would run these really like later on in graduate school when I started upping our flow capacity, start running, so cytokine assays and killing assays, and we started doing crazy stuff on a flow cytometer, like, hey, can we run viral counts on here? And just like trying to hack the flow cytometer essentially, right? And so, so what I would do on these really long experiments, long incubations, is I would go for a run, like in these 4-hour incubations, and then I'd come back and I would nap, and I would put a hat over my head, and it was a FlowJo branded hat. Go figure, man. It was just like sinking my brain or something. Yeah. So anyway, so it was just like, it was a lot of fun. And the lesson that if someone was like, give a graduate school talk on like how to be successful in graduate school, realize that the PhD is a 10,000 hour degree. There's a lot of ways to slice this, right? And I think people screw up in the way they like organize their thoughts around it. Look, it's very likely you don't have any responsibilities. It's very likely, practically speaking, that you don't have a mortgage or anyone that's dependent on you at all. You might not even have a dog. It is the time to figure out what you can work every single week and still be a healthy human being and not do what I saw a lot of people do, which is like work 100 and then work 20, then work 100. And this is hours per week, right? It's an ultra marathon. Like get in there and do like, if it's 60 hours and that's what you can handle per week, then do that. And it's not a flex. It's just like you are literally trying to accrue get that time in and get it not as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible so that you can maintain that level of performance, right? Because essentially, if you think about a PhD is like, you're going to have for science. It's like, we're creating an Olympic level scientist, right? This is something this is your full-time job, right? Full-time plus. And I think that's what I realized as I became kind of midway through my PhD. I was like, wait a minute. And once I kind of had that realization of like, okay, this is an endurance effort and I need to figure out what a sustained effort can be. And of course, you're going to go beyond that sometimes, right? But this isn't a time to be thinking about work-life balance. Okay. This is a time to be like, I'm going to be an Olympic athlete as a PhD. It is a time to do that, right? Because that's just how that degree works. And I think that would be, and I would do that again in a heartbeat of like, how do you figure that out? And it's important because if you figure that out early, then that's something you can take with and be like, I know where my limits are. And of course, because life's going to get a crap load more complicated on the other end of the PhD, right? And all the things that you don't need to worry about now. It's a singular pursuit, right? And people are like, oh, singular pursuit of publications. No, it's a singular pursuit of a research project that you created. And the only person that cares about it is you, right? It's very rare that that's ever going to happen again, right? You're going to be on a team. You're going to be working on team projects. You're going to be dependent on other people. They're going to go like how every team project goes, right? Where there's always going to be that one person. It's just the way it is. You know what I mean? And so you're going to have a mortgage. And you're going to have more complications in your life. So use that time to really figure out what you're capable of, like in terms of your work and how you can run it like an ultra. So anyway, it's not a digression. I just think it's something that's really important because some of these grad schools tell people.
I think it's critical. And there's like those kind of, that era for me too was kind of it was kind of figuring out what was that like sustainable level of like pushing it, but not burning out. I'm sure from, you were kind of scarred from the Red Bull experience. Like, I don't want that. And for me, so it was like one, finding like the sustainability, like what is the limit without burning out, but also what is as little that I could survive on, like from just like personally, being in the lab with, let's just say I had friends who were like on Wall Street just living, and I was like, I'm not living like you guys. And I resented it for sure. And I'm not saying that it's a good thing to be underpaid. I'm not saying that, but I turned lemon into lemonade in this way. I was like, okay, what can I sustainably live on, sustenance wise, and still maintain my sanity? And how can I push it to as much as I can without burning out? And for me, it was that experience kind of led into Exceeder, where it was like, okay, like I don't need all these bells and whistles that, TechCrunch is telling you that you should have. Right. And I was like, no, like I was in the lab super broke and I was still having a blast, like having an absolute blast. So I was like, okay, here's the baseline of like burn, like personal burn. And then it's time to take it up. Like, let's see how much mileage we can get out of this and do this for as long as possible. And so that was my experience. It's kind of like without any, obviously with 2020 and 2021, it was like cash for everybody, just like cash for everybody. And then you never have that point where you're tested. Like, what do you actually need to not bottom out and also not to redline too much? And you didn't have to have that introspection. But like, for me, that was like critical to my kind of business philosophy. Well, for better or for worse, it's like scar tissue I've built up and I carry that with me to this day. But when you were talking about kind of like finding the sustainable path, I saw it on the other end as well.
No, I love that. I love the insight because it applies to both like it applies to the personal management of your time. It applies to your own finances, right? But it also applies to how you create a business, right? And like, because you can't, in all of these, you can't overextend yourself. There is such a thing as redlining, right? And you also can't, I would also say you also can't underspend, right? Because then all of a sudden you're on the other end of this, right? And that's a really interesting insight. Like I would have never like thought about relating those, but it's like, it's essentially kind of core to the thesis that like, hey, how do you run not just like a sustainable business, but like, how do you run an efficient business, right? How do you measure that? And how do you engineer to build for that? Right. I still think we're in this I still think we're in the hangover period where there's just so much capital. Right. And to your point, that's almost like antithetical to the fact that like we pay graduate students, at least when I was there, like essentially almost at the poverty line.
Yeah, nothing.
Which is sort of crazy. Like, how do you reconcile those two things? And I think that maybe the danger there, and we're certainly seeing the downside of it now, right, with a lot of different layoffs in biotech, is like you have a lot of lives that are being fundamentally uprooted, right? Because you had, I think maybe when you train graduate students in an environment where they're literally like what flavor of ramen, and then then you put them in charge of a business or a team, and then you're like, it's party time. I think then that's a bit of a twisted environment, right? I think that's tough. I think the lesson that you're talking about in terms of like moderation and sobriety maybe is like a really interesting one. I hadn't thought about like applying that same.
Not by choice. Like you're right. It was like I'm sure it could have played out in a very different way if you were talking about the rotations. I didn't happen to stick in a lab that was like there's like a slosh run on campus for some labs and they just ball out, and like you talk about consumable spend, like $40K, whatever, stick it in the freezer. Oh, I forgot that I bought that. Like, there's kind of like that element, but I just wasn't in that lab. So it was kind of like, and not by, just habitat, the lab that I gravitated to was just, the light. I was like, oh, sunlight. Like it was just the lab, and our postdoc Candace was like, again, like someone who just kind of like took everyone under her wing. Similar situation. I was like, yep, I'm in this lab for better or for worse. And kind of these like, it was, again, not planned, just like stumbled into it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting lesson though. I think something else that like, I don't know how you'd run this study, but like I think you have to hustle harder when you're a graduate student in those kind of labs because you are kind of more in a startup already. Like the way you're phrasing, I've never even thought about this way, but like you and I were working for startups, right? I mean, here was a PI who was getting emails from his, from the university being like, hey, by the way, you better cover 10% more of your salary next year in grants. And they're like, holy shit. Like, which was an absolute reality for our PIs, right? And they're like, how the heck do I do this? And you realize like there's kind of a lot of skin in the game because you can't have your lab fail. This, like, and grad students are in these smaller labs. Like when your PI comes to you and is like, hey, I'm going to get some of this data in the grant. Like what they're actually telling you is like, I need to eat. So do you. So you know what I mean? Like, let's get this production going. And I think that there's a lot more in that. It's like, I hadn't even thought about it that way, but like, man, we need to figure out who's like in these small labs and be like, all right.
I truly believe this. Like, I mean, it was like a startup experience. It truly was in an academic realm. And academia has its own kind of like economic funniness to it. So, I had to, after that coming out of the lab, I was like, well, time to learn, non-academic, like practices and like shed that baggage.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Mike Stadnisky. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again for part 2 of our conversation with Mike. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceedr.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.